Anyway, so Bonson goes on kind of in this vein. He says Dr. Stein has he kind of makes this point that Dr. Stein hasn't dealt with his argument yet. In fact, he hasn't even entered into the debate yet, he suggests, right? He's talking about something else, and I'm talking about this thing, right? And now he's going to kind of, zero in on some of the issues that he's going to find with Dr. Stein. So he says that Dr. Stein has mentioned logical binds and logical self-contradictions. He says that he holds that the laws of logic are universal, but however, they are conventional in nature, and that's not at all acceptable philosophically, right? You can't have a universal law and it's conventional. If laws of logic are conventional in nature, right, made up by people, right, like driving on which side of the road, then you might have different societies that use different laws of logic. That is, certain societies could have a convention that says, go ahead and contradict yourself. And if they're just made up by convention, you'd have to go with that, right? That is the point that he's making here.
Right. So Dr. Bonson says that the laws of logic are not conventional and not sociological. He would say that the laws of logic have a transcendental necessity about them. They're universal, they're invariant, and they're not material in nature. And if they are not that, then I'd like to know, Dr. Bonson says, in an atheist universe, how it's possible to have laws in the first place, and secondly, how it's possible to justify those laws. So again, this is Dr. Bonson trying to lasso Dr. Stein and pull him on to the same pedestal that Dr. Bonson is on, which is the ability to use the laws of logic. And so, this is, you're going to use them, so therefore you're then able to use a positive case. This isn't neutral ground, and this isn't something that only Christians have. This is something that both sides have. And Dr. Bonson's saying, from my Christian worldview perspective, the laws of logic are like this. They seem to reflect the same nature and character that most philosophers probably agree with them. But now Dr. Stein, who seems to be more of a naturalist, whether strict or not, here it gets a little muddy. He's saying, well, I don't have to prove that. I just lack a belief in your God, and I just can fire the cannons at you. But when you do that, you're making laws of logic and inference and deductive arguments, inductive arguments, abductive, and the whole gamut. And so now you're saying, I can use these. Well, what position do you have to use these? Especially, they seem to contradict your naturalistic underpinnings. And so this might turn into a different, not different type of debate, but one that Dr. Stein doesn't want to get on that same pedestal.
Yeah, and this is a point that I was trying to make in our last episode here, right? Notice Dr. Stein uses the laws of logic to argue against these various arguments for the existence of God. And instead of Bonson saying, okay, well, let's look at these arguments against the existence of God, he goes back further and says, well, wait a minute, before you use the laws of logic to argue against the existence of God, where do you get the laws of logic from? And so he is going back a step further. He's asking about his presuppositions with regard to the laws of logic. Where are they coming from? Where do laws come from in a materialistic universe, right? That's what he's getting at. And so that's the basic idea here. And so he says the laws of logic, he tells Stein here, are abstract. As abstract entities, which is the appropriate philosophical term, they are not materialistic. As universal, they are not experienced to be true. There may be experiences whereby the laws of logic are used, but no one has universal experience. No one has tried every possible instance of the laws of logic. As invariant, which is unchangeable, they don't fit into what most materialists would tell us about the constantly changing nature of the world. So laws of logic are abstract, universal, and invariant. And he's pushing this whole, position here, saying, how can you have, if you're a materialist, how can you have laws of logic that have these characteristics? Mm-hmm. And of course, the answer is, well, you can't, right? Or you're going to have to give me a good argument to come up with that. And so in effect, Bonson now is kind of flipping the script, right? It was Stein saying, I'm going to give you arguments. I'm going to refute your arguments against, the existence of God. And Bonson is saying, well, what you're trying to use to refute the arguments, you don't have an argument for. You don't have an argument for the laws of logic, their existence, their nature, their basis. And so let's start there and let's start there before you start giving me arguments. Right. Tell me what's the basis of argument.
Right. Because Bonson's going to want to take this another step further and say, what else is something that is abstract, universal, and invariant? And he's going to point to a mind holding the laws of logic, and that mind he's going to point to as being God, that makes things abstract, universal, and invariant. And so this isn't outside the realm of the nature of the debate. This is going to be proof for the question of does God exist. So this isn't doing it as a source of a point against Stein, but this is part of his positive case as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay. And then Dr. Bahnsen goes on to say, and so you see, we have a real problem on our hands. Dr. Stein wants to use the laws of logic tonight. I maintain he is borrowing from my worldview, right? So if the atheist idea or the materialist idea says that only material things occur, or that there are certain things in the world that are useful but are just conventions that are helpful for people to communicate things, but then also saying that those communication values are universal and abstract, that seems to be a point against that worldview. And so where would he get this idea from? And so he would get this idea, Bahnsen saying, from the Christian worldview, from my worldview. And so from there, we're at an impasse now, because you're admitting that God doesn't exist, or you're claiming that God doesn't exist, but then you're also admitting to various aspects of a world. If God did exist, these would be the natures of something that you use. And this seems to square the circle rather than wanting to have it as evidence of against me.
Yeah, and really what Bahnsen is doing is attacking Stein's worldview, his materialistic worldview. That's what he's doing. And he says, and is basically saying, in your materialistic worldview, you can't even have the existence of the laws of logic. They just don't make sense. They're incongruent. You can't have things like the laws of logic exist if your worldview is true. And so that's really the presuppositional approach, right? You look at the presuppositions of the person that you're considering, their worldview things are ideas, and that's what you go after in making your argument.
Bahnsen then says, for you see, within the Christian theistic world, the laws of logic make sense. With the theistic worldview, there can be abstract, universal, invariant entities, such as the laws of logic. Within the Christian theistic worldview, you cannot contradict yourself, because in so doing, you engage in the nature of lying, and that's contradictory to the character of God as we perceive it.
So there, notice he suggests it's a worldview argument. Mm-hmm. It's not an argument about specific evidences for or against the existence of God. It's an argument about which worldview best explains or has to be the case in order for these various types of things to exist. For instance, the laws of logic, right? And so he says, so the laws of logic are something that Dr. Stein is going to have to explain as an atheist, or else, notice, relinquish using them, right? If you can't explain where it comes from and its basis and why it exists, and then stop using it. You're borrowing from my worldview. My worldview has an explanation for it. Yours doesn't. So give me back my laws of logic, right? Now, Joshua Pillow makes a comment at this point. He says, the specific issue you need to realize, he tells us, is not over any particular law of logic, but rather the preconditions of logic itself. There it is, right? Yeah. What has to be the case in order for logic to exist? That's a precondition for logic. What has to be the case, right? What view of reality is presupposed by appeal to the necessity of such things as laws of logic, right? What worldview takes into account the existence of laws of logic and explains them, right? What has to be the case for that? And of course, that's what Bahnsen is really pushing at here. Mm-hmm. He's suggesting that Stein's worldview doesn't account for the laws of logic. That doesn't mean that they can't use them. That doesn't mean that, they don't exist, that sort of thing. But his worldview doesn't account for them.
Right. Dr. Bahnsen goes on to say that the transcendental argument for the existence of God, then, which Dr. Stein has yet to touch and which I don't believe he can surmount, is that without the existence of God, it's impossible to prove anything. Again, Dr. Bahnsen's initial opening one was that the nature of the debate itself, that we were having a debate, is proof for the existence of God. And so here he's saying that the transcendental argument for the existence of God is that without the existence of God, it's impossible to prove anything. And if you can prove something or think that you can prove something, then what you're doing is you're taking from the Christian worldview. And by that implication, you're admitting that God exists. And so to say that God doesn't exist would be a contradiction within the scope of what you're doing. So you're going to have to be able to prove that you can prove something. And by proving that you can prove something, you're actually proving God exists. And that's the end of the debate, and we don't have to go any further because everyone gets it. It clicks. The end of the movie happens. Credits roll. Crowd cheers. Well, and that's because the atheistic world, you cannot justify and cannot account for laws in general, laws of thought in particular, laws of nature. You can't account for the human mind and the fact that it's nothing more than electrochemical processes and events, and you cannot give us moral absolutes. So there's a lot of things that people, just normal people, I think, kind of
take for granted,
for granted, but also, since they take it for granted, to say, well, you know, when you say that you love your wife, that's just chemicals firing in your brain, and why they fire is because whenever you see your wife or your husband, that's just the least resistant pathway to get those endorphins moving. So that's all it means by loving your wife. There's no thing there out of those chemicals that fire the pathways that make it easier. You just happen to chemically fizz with another person who makes you chemically fizz, and hopefully vice versa. And then to not cheat on your wife, well, there's no real reason not to, other than just societal conventions. And if you really wanted to, there's nothing that precludes you from not, other than just whatever subjective value that you make up. But
there's no ought there.
Right. Yeah, exactly.